الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. I hope everyone's doing well. So today's session, as I said, we'll be discussing the topic of taqleed. So we have spoken about in quite some length the topic of ijtihad. But the discussion of taqleed has been normally within the lens of ijtihad. So when we talk about the institutionalization of taqleed, therefore even when it comes to new issues and ijtihad is taking place, it's a form of partial ijtihad and or semi-taqleed and semi-ijtihad. And this is why I alluded to before that a lot of the classical critiques of taqleed were in reference to scholars who were competent, but they chose to stick to their madhabs, and so the criticism was that look, there's no attempt to even try to find out what the hadith have said or what the Quranic ayat have said or what is more authentic. You just stick to what your madhab has got to say, and everything you do, all your new issues that you deal with, or this semi-form of ijtihad that you may be doing, is still within the rubric of taqleed. And it is important that an alim engages themselves with the Quran and Sunnah to some degree, especially when the truth becomes manifest. So that was the context of classical critique of taqleed that you will find in the books like I'lam Muwaqqi'in of Ibn al-Qayyim, the books of Shawkani, Sana'ani, and so on and so forth. So that discussion of ijtihad and how taqleed kind of fits within that, we've seen that within the realm of some of the case studies that we've done, how ijtihad, if you want to call it that, is working within the lens of taqleed. Now, what we want to discuss in this lecture is that how does taqleed, or what is the ruling of taqleed, and how does this affect the general public? So the ami, the lay person, how are they meant to approach the topic of taqleed and madhabs? Right? So should a lay person adopt a madhab? Are they bound to the madhab? So we spoke of the mufti giving fatwa and being trained in a madhab and the fact that they should stick to their madhab. We've also discussed the idea of the mufti within the madhab, how they new issues, how they're meant to deal with it within the rubric of the madhab, and then out of necessity they go outside the madhab. And we've looked at case studies for that. But what about the lay person, the average, what do we say, Joe Blogs on the street? What should their relationship be with madhabs? That's what we'll be discussing inshallah today. A discussion of modern discussions of taqleed cannot be done without a reference back to the modern Salafi movement. The modern Salafi movement, the purpose here is not to critique the modern Salafi movement, or maybe we'll be mentioning some forms of critique, but overall that's not the purpose. It's just to be a historical analysis of what happened, right, to some degree. So what we're looking at here is just some of the impact that the Salafi discourse had on discussions of taqleed. And you normally see that there is a lot of scholars make a reference to the topic, to the fact that Salafism is a modernist movement. Right? Salafism is a modernist movement, and that sounds very strange because of the fact that when someone looks at Salafism or Salafis, right, you see extremely conservative believers. Right? The women would be wearing full hijab. Most of the Salafis take the view that hijab, niqab is necessary. Men would have big beards. They'd be very strict on the haram, halal, prohibition of music, all the stuff that you would associate with a conservative Muslim, a traditionalist Muslim, if you like. You will see that the Salafis, not only would they adopt that, but they usually have very strong positions on all those topics. So whereas on the other hand, when we say a modernist is someone that we associate with some sort of relaxed ideas of Islam, making attacking the jurists and the traditional Islam being too stringent and strict unnecessarily, and celebrating the freedom that Islam gives, etc., etc. So when you describe Salafism as a modernist movement, it can be quite difficult to wrap your head around because of the lived reality that we all experience. But how do we make sense of that? And I do think that's an accurate statement if understood within a wider context, without being bogged down with the peripherals, not belittling the peripherals are extremely important. I'm talking about in a methodological perspective. Now, a modernist, I think we touched upon this before, but just briefly, we've defined, if you haven't defined it before, I apologize, to quickly define it again, is what we would say is that someone who has internalized Western, usually critique, Orientalist critique of Islam, or Western critique of Islam, or the enemies of Muslims, their critique of Islam. So they've internalized those critiques, said yes, those critiques are valid, but that is not Islam. Islam is something to the contrary. So for example, when they would say Islam has barbaric laws such as the hudud, instead of fighting the concept of saying these are not barbaric, they would internalize that and say yes, these laws, these hudud are barbaric, but this is not Islam. It's the fault of, and then they can blame various people. It could either blame the jurist, they could blame hadith narrators, the hadith, it could be whatever, right? They have their own different methods of doing so, but they have internalized the critique, and they have but then they've disassociated themselves. So where the kuffar or the enemies of Islam would say this shows there's a problem within Islam, right? They would say this is a problem, but it's not with Islam. So one of the main features of modernist movements then has been of revival. And how do you do revival? Is that there must be a shift in the way we deal with authority. Because anyone that wants to cause to some sort of revival will naturally have to do away with authority. If you come to me and say to me that accept this interpretation, and I am currently bogged down by authority, so I say, well, I'm a Hanafi. How do you make sense of, well, what do the Hanafi say? And that becomes an impediment for one's revival, because the people that you're addressing are shackled within these madhabs or scholars that they do taqleed of. So the way to the first move has to be that let's eradicate taqleed, right? Let's eradicate authority, and therefore provide a method of Islam which is much more brought back to the text, right? You bring them back to the text, and then of course the text is not just, it's not an agenda-free endeavor. There will be a specific methodology in which you want me to adopt to go back to the text. So therefore, the initial stage is the denial of taqleed, and therefore a questioning of authority of the traditional madahib. Now, then the conclusion after that of the modernist, right, that we usually associate modernists to, will be that we need to bring an Islam which is more egalitarian. We need to bring an Islam which gives rights to non-Muslims, equal rights to non-Muslims, and freedom of speech, freedom of whatever you're trying to argue for, the person's arguing for. Now, what does a Salafi do, or where does a Salafi come about? Is that the Salafi agrees with the first premise, and this is why we can argue that the Salafi is a modernist phenomena, in the sense that this is the idea of rejecting madahib, right? In the sense that you have scholars without any affiliation to a madhab, right? And not only that, they argue to others without working within the prism of a madhab. So they're working as complete independent scholars and refuting those who work within the prism of a madhab. So the Salafi would start off with that premise, but the difference here is that predominantly the Salafism that survived, which is the Wahhabi Salafism. This is not the lesson to go into the history of Salafism, although it's an important topic. But the Salafism that survived, which is the Wahhabi Salafism, with the Saudi state being the core of it, the nucleus of it, which is that you adopt Wahhabi theology, and then you have a fiqh, which is not strictly abiding by a madhab. But the process in which you approach the Quran and Sunnah is within the prism of the standard Sunni methods of approaching Quran and Sunnah. So there's an authority given to the Quran, an authority given to the Sunnah, a very strong authority given to Hadith in terms of the Isnad. The traditional method of Isnad is occupied. There's a method, they adopt Qiyas, Ijma', and so and all the peripherals that come with them. Although they may differ on slight differences, but they approach those topics. So therefore, even though the Salafi has rejected the authority of the four madhabs, right? Again, I'm being very generic here. There are some, nowadays it's changed again, because many Salafis do adopt a madhab. But the Salafism that was famous from the 60s, 70s up to the 90s onwards, especially some of those we had experienced in the 90s and 2000s here in the West, that Salafism which doesn't adopt a madhab, distance himself from the madhab, but their fiqh would usually coincide with one of the four or within the spectrum of the four madhabs. So if you take a case study of someone like Sheikh Nasruddin al-Albani, rahimahullah, so Sheikh Nasruddin al-Albani, he kind of epitomizes modern Salafiyah, right? So Salafism, right, is most famous, the promoter, if you like, is Albani. And Albani clearly has no allegiance to any madhab. But him doing away with authority and the method he adopts is a method of a strict adherence to the Quran and Sunnah, and the Sunnah based upon his methodology of how to authenticate hadith, which is more or less, generally speaking, in line with classical muhaddithin. It's not, a complete innovative method he has. It's within that spectrum. Now, therefore, his fiqhi conclusions, right, most of the time will come within the spectrum of the four madhabs, with save a few odd issues, right? But the predominant fiqh of his is within the scope of the four madhabs. He rarely takes positions outside of the four madhabs or outside anyone that has, outside the positions held within the four madhabs. So, in that sense, the actual fiqh of Sheikh Nasruddin Albani would not be innovative, meaning the actual fiqh itself. You may argue against the method in which he adopts it, but the result of it are not necessarily going to be that radical. From on an individual madhab will be radical. So if I'm looking at from a Hanafi lens, there will be many views that go against the Hanafi madhab. I'm just a Shafi'i, but if you're looking at the spectrum of the four madhabs, it will be within that. And this is why the difference with the Salaf, the modernist, right, that we normally associate with being modernist, they would do away with the methodology, they would do away with the madhab, the authority, but their method to the Quran and Sunnah will be usually radically different. Therefore, their conclusions will be radically different. So in that sense, the Salafis, of the Salafiyah of Sheikh Albani, for example, is a modernist phenomena in terms of doing away with the authority of the madhabs, but in conclusion or the application of the method is closer to the madhahib. And the reason being is because the method of his is the method of giving authority to the Quran and Sunnah and Qiyas and so on and so forth. So therefore is mimic the method of the Sunni scholars before him. So that's what you kind of and that kind of explains the idea of Salafi and briefly and their phenomena. So then Sheikh Albani, for example, is different to, let's say, Ibn Taymiyyah, because Ibn Taymiyyah has a clear affiliation to Hanbali madhab, works within the Hanbali madhab, there is ijtihad outside it, where Sheikh Albani doesn't have a pivot of a madhab. He doesn't say ashabuna, there's no ashabuna, right, for him in terms of fiqh. There's no, these are our madhab, but said now we're doing ijtihad. So the scholars that kind of practice ijtihad, and there was in the past, they will still have a madhab that they affiliate to. Sheikh Albani kind of breaks away from that, and that's the more famous Salafism than a lot of us were exposed to. Although now we're getting different shades of more Hanbali Salafis or Shafi'i Salafis. But our discussion is not about Salafiyah so much. It's just to touch upon this point, inshallah. Now, after listening to the last segment, there may be questions about Salafiyya and the different shades. So for further reading, because we don't, like I said, our purpose isn't to talk about Salafism. So I was just trying to get to the popular Salafism of Sheikh Albani that, as I said, a lot of us in the West have been exposed to. There's a book written by Henry, I always pronounce his name wrong, Lezeur. I'm sure that's wrong. Henry Lezeur. It's called The Making of Salafism. The Making of Salafism. It's a very good book. It will tell you about how we ended up with the Salafiyah that we get today, up to, let's say, at least the 1970s, 80s. He talks about Taqiyuddin Hilal in his journey. It's a fascinating book, and he talks about the original relationship with modernist and Salafism, and how this kind of amalgamates in the character of Sheikh Rashid Rida. But that's another discussion for another day, not for our purposes today. So if you have further questions, or you may think that the discussion was a bit simple and didn't pick up the nuance, well, it wasn't meant to pick up the nuance, but for further reading, if you are interested in the nuance, will be this book, The Making of Salafism. Anyway, there's also another book called Ma Ba'da Salafiyya, but that's slightly different, but we can maybe talk about that again in some future sessions. So what changed? Right, so if you're sticking to the Salafism of Sheikh Albani, The Salafism, Sheikh Albani argues that the lay people should be given more, if you like, more credit, because in the past, the lay person, the Ami, was not given any rank, any respect, right? Like if you remember the 7 categories of ijtihad of Ibn Kamal Basha, the 7th category, which was still a mufti, they describe him as being like, doesn't know the night from day, and describes it very dismissively, and that's still a person that studied. So we have discussed a mufti muqallid. The Ami, the lay person who's a butcher or a farmer, whatever, right, not studied, they're not given any worth when it comes to their opinions, and rather they, you have these kind of phrases like al-awam kal an'am. The lay person is like cattle, right? So wherever you shift them to, that's where they go. And so you have a very dismissive approach to the lay person. But because of the publishing house and the accessibility of information, the lay people can also, one is that the literacy rate goes up, so people can read much more. And number two, well, it's all great having to be able to read, but you can't access material. But books are accessible now. So you can, I remember when I was in the book fair in Egypt, they have this place, like a bunch of stalls, I forget the name now. So it was just, so basically what it is that people who may have been like a general or someone, their libraries. So not all of these people are scholars, or their libraries, and their family may sell them, right? So you can go to Maktaba Fulan and there'll be all these books and you can buy them, etc. And many of these figures were not alims, they were not ulama, they could be generals, they could be politicians, etc. And if you see some of their libraries, there'll be a whole host of Islamic books that, I'll give you an example, right? So you may go to one of these books and find the Kitab al-Umm of Ash-Shafi'i, right? Because the Kitab al-Umm Ash-Shafi'i is published. Many Shafi'i scholars for centuries never had the Kitab al-Umm, right? So now, if you look at this scenario, that you have Imam al-Shafi'i's Kitab al-Umm, and you got a lay person, right? A lay person who's got access to this book, whereas ulama of the Shafi'i madhab, for many decades or centuries, if not, never had access to this book, right? Today, for example, you can have a student of knowledge, the Hanafi student of knowledge, and he goes to, he has some money, his mum's given him, dad's given him, 16, 17 years old. And what he does is, he goes and he purchases the Kitab al-Asl of Imam Muhammad, right? He purchased the Kitab al-Asl of Imam Muhammad, and he has this book, can barely read it, but now he has access to a book that we mentioned before, that Ibn Abidin doesn't seem to have the original Kitab al-Asl, right? So the point I'm saying is that accessibility is risen, not saying knowledge, but I'm saying accessibility is risen, and you're literate, so you have some more knowledge of reading and writing, even if you're not an alim. So what this does is, it gives people a false sense of ilm, like, oh, I can engage in hadith, I can engage in Quran. And so people like Sheikh Albani, they were saying, well, not only are we going to do ijtihad and question the authority of the madhahib, but we can actually tell people, the general public, and say, by the way, your madhab is wrong, right? The Hanafi madhab got this wrong, the Shafi'i madhab got this wrong, the Sunnah method is this, the Sunnah method is that. So it's not of, we respect your khilaf, we're telling you you're wrong. It doesn't mean that they're going to have to go out and do, let's say, inkar, some would do, go and reject opinions outright. But there's a clear dismissal of the different madahib, and it's a da'wah to the general public to say to them, here is the hadith. So again, if you look at the Shaykh Albani Salafism, he writes his book Sifatul Salat al-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's translated in English as well, the Prophet's prayer described. This is a book for the lay people. And most people, lay people are reading it, and they're learning that the hadith of doing this is sahih and this is one's da'if. And so the lay people are now partaking within the debate of and discussion of Quran and Sunnah and hermeneutics, and challenging the Hanafi position and saying to you, oh, by the way, your Hanafi position over here, you got it wrong. So now, in response to this, modern debates of taqleed for the lay people have been that, no, your job is not to engage with Quran and Sunnah. Your job is to do taqleed and follow a madhab, an authority, and do what they got to tell you to say. because you are not able, you are not competent to be engaging with the Quran and Sunnah. Right? So this is what the modern debate has been. And the subcontinent, you have the Ahli Hadith that did something similar. But I'm just trying to focus on Shaykh Albani because it's more popular. So similarly there, if you look at the Indian Hanafi scholars, they will say taqleed is wajib. You're not allowed to follow, you can't be going around looking at daleel and stuff or what you think is daleel. And to the contrary, the lay person who thinks he's following daleel, in essence, they are doing taqleed of their imams. Because when you look at, that's Shaykh Albani's tahqiq that told you it's authentic. And if you look at someone else's tahqiq, you say the contrary, but you have no ilm to do tarjih, but you just take Albani's authority, so that's your taqleed you're doing of. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this, which I think most people are aware of, and nor do I need to go and defend the position that the lay people should not be engaging in evidences like this and trying to, do tarjih based upon evidence, because most of us will know this. But it's to touch upon the fact that the discussion in usul about the lay person and their relationship to the madhab has been through the lens of Salafiyya telling the lay people to follow based upon evidence. Therefore, you'll find that even Albani talks about this, that there's 3 categories of people. You have the mujtahid and you have the muqallid, and that's known. Mujtahid does ijtihad, muqallid does taqleed. And then there could be some mujtahids or people that are muqallids like ulama, but then you can do ijtihad in some issues, no problem. But there's the 3rd category that he talks about, which is called ittiba'. And ittiba' is defined as the lay person following a daleel, even the student of knowledge. So they follow with daleel. So this category of people who are lay people, they should be following what is stronger, not following authority. That's where he's shifted away from the mainstream position on this topic. And so therefore, in response was, that's not a real category. These lay people we're talking about doesn't apply to them. They can't be going following daleel. And so although I think academically it's hard to convince a layperson when they think they've seen the evidence otherwise, but I think time now has demonstrated that this method is not practical. Why? Because fiqh is not restricted to placing of the hands in salah or raising of the hands in ruku' and sujood, right? Fiqh has to do with mu'amalat, with masal of zakat, for hajj, etc. And the layperson trying to follow daleel in all those cases is going to find out that it's much more difficult than originally anticipated. When it comes to placing the hands in salah on the chest or below the navel, the debate is quite simple. You got a hadith here, you got a hadith here. Or it's not that simple, but you got Albani saying it's authentic, you take him, he says more sahih, and you follow that. You can overcomplicate it and look at what other ulama have said about the authenticity of the hadith. But the point being is that even the mas'ala itself is not hard to comprehend, above, below. But many of these other masail of hajj and zakat, etc., just the tasawwur al-mas'ala, forget evidence is difficult to comprehend. So therefore, people quickly realize that, or not that quickly, but people realize that this is not a feasible method. So right now, we've kind of moved away from that. But the purpose of mentioning this is that the discussions of taqleed for the layperson has been follow a madhab, right? Or follow daleel. Follow a madhab or follow a daleel. But you'll notice now, when I told you the last segment, is that classical discourse on taqleed for the awam was different. But because of this modern, we'll call it fitna or movement, we've had to shift the debate to what we are usually exposed to. Hopefully allows us to move on to what I'll call the classical debate of taqleed. And this may move on to the next session. We'll see inshallah how far we can get on. So first thing, material. Right? Books, material, where to look, where not to look. So there's many books on taqleed and ijtihad. Right? So for our purposes, I'm just going to mention 2, and then there's a 3rd book which is far more larger. There is the book written by Imam Shrumbulali, right? Imam Shrumbulali, the author of Nur al-Idah and his commentaries on Maraqi Falah. And this book hopefully should be made accessible to you. If it's not, you can easily Google it and find it. His book on Ijtihad and Taqleed. And there's also Iqtul Jeed of Shah Waliullah Muhaddith Dehlawi, which is also a book on the Masail of Ijtihad and Taqleed. And to be honest, there's tens and tens of books. Samhudi in the Shafi Madhab's got a book on it. You've got Adab al-Ifta wal-Istifta, or Adab al-Mufti wal-Mustafti by Ibn Salah, in the Muqaddimah of Muhaddab, in the Sharh Muhaddab of An-Nawawi, he's got a discussion on this. And the list goes on and on. There's a bunch of books, and more recently there was a contemporary scholar in 3 volumes. I forget his name right now. It's called The Madhub, where he has a 3-volume book, discusses all things related to ijtihad and taqleed. So there's a vast turath of material that discusses the topic of ijtihad and taqleed more specifically. So let's try to break this down. Now, historically, if we go back now to the time of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, things are very simple for the lay person now. So that before we looked at in the beginning through the lens of the fuqaha sahaba, Ibn Abbasis and the Abdullah Mas'uds and Ibn Umars radiyallahu anhum. Now we're talking about the average sahabi, right? The average sahabi who doesn't have the time, opportunity to dedicate themselves to learning from the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, thinking about these masail or going to other Sahaba learning. They're just a person that's been occupied with family, with trying to earn a living, and so on and so forth. These Sahaba, once the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passes away, they simply go to other Sahaba and ask them questions, right? And then you get the era of the Tabi'een, the lay Tabi'i, right? They will go to Sahaba, the Fuqaha, the Tabi'een, and ask them questions. And there's numerous scenarios of that where you get a layperson come to Ibn Abbas, or someone comes to say, "Ya Ibn Abbas, this is what's happened to me. What do I do?" And then Ibn Abbas will respond, halal, haram, yes, no, do you have to do this, you have to do that. And you can go through the stories of the fuqaha, and you'll find numerous instances of lay people coming to them and asking questions. What we don't have, there's 2 things to note here. Number one, just to kind of sort out the issue of, is it allowed for them to, so we didn't even discuss this in the previous 2 sections, right? Because I just think it's such a nonsensical view that the layperson has to seek evidence, right? So the question that is taqleed even allowed, which I didn't even entertain, because I think it's just such a bizarre opinion, but let's assume to entertain it, the layperson must ask for evidence. Well, what's the evidence to the contrary? Well, the evidence to the contrary are all these hundreds and hundreds of stories where Sahaba and Tabi'un are asked questions and they give answers with that evidence, right? You go to the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shaybah, you go to the Musannaf of Abdul Razak. If you've seen some of the cases in the Shawmani Athar, Imam Tahawi, and these kind of works, right, where you have a lot of Athar of Sahaba and Tabi'un in there, when so many times they're asked questions, right, and they respond back by saying, your nikah is valid. If there's a fiqh to nikah, right? Or your salah is valid, or do this, do that. And in, I don't know, say majority, but maybe a majority of them, no evidence is provided. It's just said, this is halal. So this is the definition of taqleed. Why? Because in taqleed, you've made this person your authority. Because you don't have the ability to understand the evidences in the Quran and Sunnah. And people sometimes find this strange. What do you mean I don't have the evidence in the Quran? So if you cite the hadith, I can understand it. The point is not saying that you cannot understand the alfaz. The point is that you don't have the ability to see or work out why this hadith is an evidence in contrast to maybe other hadith. That's what the meaning is. So for example, if you come to me and you say to me, what's the hukam of dhabiha, of uduhiyya? Is uduhiyya wajib? I say in the Hanafi madhab uduhiyya is wajib, right? And they say, give me dalil. Okay, I'll give you dalil. The Messenger of Allah says that the one who has not done the uduhiyya, right, وَلَا يَقْرُ مُصَلَّانَا, they should not come close to our musalla, meaning to Eid, they shouldn't come to Eid Salah. So here, evidence of wujub. They say, okay, we understood that. But are they actually following the lead? The answer is no, because they haven't got the ability to go and verify the authenticity of the hadith, to work out what the implication of such a wa'id is. They have not seen what the contrary evidences are, and all the intricacies that may come with that. They may not have the ability to do any of that. Many of the debates may be based upon lugha, how we understand amar, nahi, wa'id, and so on and so forth. So therefore, they've understood the evidence in terms of the alfaz, but they don't have the ability to critically engage with the evidence. Right? It's similar like if a layperson goes to a doctor and says to a doctor, what's this? The doctor explains it. That's nice. You can ask for that. Itminanu qalb. Yatma'inna qalbi, you can ask. But for me to say I'm critically engaging with the current knowledge I have of medicine is nonsense. I base on my tarjih, what I prefer based upon authority. These people I trust more, so I take from them. So this is important. Why? It shows that taqleed in its actual meaning was found in the era of the Sahaba Tabi'un. But what you don't find is the madhab. Right? Madhab, adopting a madhab. So you don't have people saying we don't have followers of Ibn Abbas as a madhab. Right? You start getting a informal following that in geographical locations people tend to go to the most knowledgeable, and that happened to be certain Sahaba, then certain Tabi'un that became the Mufti of Kufa, the Mufti of Mecca, and so on and so forth. So they gained these titles and people would go to them asking questions, but there was never any notion in this time period that you are bound to a specific person. Right? So if I'm alive in the time of the Sahaba and I go and I have a mas'ala, right? So I'm confused about a mas'ala of inheritance or something, right? So I find Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anhu there, and I said to Ibn Abbas, this is the mas'ala, what's the answer? And he says, well, this is the answer. I can ask for evidence, no problem. If I don't, I can do amal upon that. So now I've asked him, is it allowed for me when I see Abdullah ibn Umar to ask him? Right? Am I allowed? We're not talking about whether it's adab. We're not talking about whether Abdullah ibn Umar will be offended saying, you asked Ibn Abbas, why you coming to me? We're not saying that. We're saying, shar'an, is there any legal obligation for me now to stick to Ibn Abbas, or can I go to someone else? Now, someone may argue that in that mas'ala, you should just do Amal ibn Abbas, no problem. Okay, let's make it, let's say, someone says it's an obligation. Something that we can all agree upon then is that I asked Ibn Abbas about this mas'ala. Is it now obligatory upon me that in every other situation I have, a question I have, I must go to Ibn Abbas? Or can I go to Abdullah ibn Umar? Right? And what we find in this era is that there is no evidence that there is any shari'i obligation. Remember this, shari'i obligation. We're not saying whether individual people did that they just took from one sahabi, or people took from certain sahaba and didn't want to take other sahaba. We're not talking about that. We have evidences of that. People did that. We're saying, is that a legal obligation? And the answer is no. And there is more or less, I've seen a consensus on this. I haven't seen anyone really dispute this point. So this means that there is no obligation of adopting a single person, right? Whether you want to call that a single person, an individual once they're alive, or that madhab and being bound to it. Such that even if you read the works or in the life of Imam Abu Hanifa, there are examples where a person has a mas'ala of nikah, like a talaq mas'ala, and they go through the fuqaha of Kufa. They ask Sufyan al-Thawri, then they ask so on, then they go to Abu Hanifa, and Abu Hanifa gives the answer. They say, if we take this makes the most sense to us. So here, lay people are not bound to any individual. They can ask whoever they want. So therefore, taqleed is taking place, but there isn't a restriction a legal restriction that they must stick to one person. Okay, there's no restriction that they must stick to one person. So this opens the question up that what is the hukam of the madhab? What's the ruling then that once the madhab are formed, does the ruling change and now it becomes an obligation and a person must adopt a madhab? Or is the ruling the same for the people that you don't need to follow a madhab? Okay, so this is where we're going to stop. I think we'll have one more session on this inshallah to kind of get through the nuts and crannies of it inshallah. In conclusion of this session, what do we learn, what to take away? Number one, in the first segment, we looked at the idea of Salafiyya and the notion of why I claim, or people claim, that it's a modernist movement, and try to explain that term. Modernist movement is not, there's a justification for that. right? There's a justification for that. But academic honesty also requires us to say that the conclusion of Madhab Salafiyya is much more in line with traditional madahib because of the methodology they adopt once they dismiss the authorities, whereas the famous modernists that we associate with the with liberal ideas or feminist modernists, whatever you want to call them, right? Their methodology, the way they approach the Quran and Sunnah is different. So therefore, there is a difference in outcome. And that's very important. It's not a minor thing, right? It's very important to make that distinction. Point number 2 was about the Salafiyya of Sheikh Albani, which we use as a person. He's not the only one who said this. There's many people before, not many people in the modern era, but Sheikh Albani stands out as one of the main scholars that epitomizes this, and he himself has no affiliation to any madhab when he does his fiqh, is the fact that even the lay people are exposed to evidences to follow evidence, not to follow madhab. Right? So you follow evidence, don't follow madhab, and you also start getting the da'wah of taqleed being impermissible. So I mean, the lay person, once you've seen the evidence, it's necessary for you to follow the evidence, not your madhab or what you've learned as being a madhab. And so most of modern taqleed debate has been trying to tackle this phenomenon of talking about how the lay person is not obligated, and rather it's dangerous a lay person to try to go and do tarjih themselves because of the fact that deen is far more complicated than that, and rather this can actually lead to a person, once doing away with authority, adopting all sorts of radical different ideas. So therefore one is obligated to stick to a madhab or obligated to follow authority. So that's what kind of the current battle has been. But this kind of moves us away then from the classical discourse of taqleed, which I was mentioning some books for. So in the last segment, I laid the foundation down for some of the basic structure of taqleed in the era of the Sahaba Tabi'un, but it raises some questions. So the next session, inshallah, we'll be looking at the implication of this and what is the obligation or lack of obligation of adopting a madhab. What is a lay person meant to do when there's an ikhtilaf? This is what we'll be looking at, inshallah, in our last session. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.